G'day, my name's Jen Ford. I'm the Principal Restoration Ecologist at Ecosure, coming to you today from Turrbal, Yagara country. Thank you Port Macquarie-Hastings Regional Council for allowing me to share some of my knowledge so together we can better restore our natural areas. We're making a series of videos so we can share information on how best to restore our natural systems. So what is ecological restoration? Well, it's about repairing and restoring our natural systems, ecosystems that are damaged, destroyed or degraded. But how do we go about that? Well, it's a complex science and a well-founded practice. So today we're going to start with how do we assess our site? What does that mean, site assessment? It's about really understanding what's going on your site. Both the history of disturbance, that might be man-made disturbance, it might be natural disturbance like cyclones or fires. It's about understanding what's here in terms of native vegetation, the weeds, yep, plenty of them. And it's also about understanding the interactions between flora and fauna. The abiotic, the non-living elements, and the biotic, the living elements. It's about putting all of that together and really understanding it so we can work out how and where to intervene. We need to maximise our efforts and we need to maximise those limited funds. So this first video is really about site assessment. So preparing to do your site assessment, sometimes I go the more old-fashioned approach, pen and paper, but I've actually got a pre-formulated or a lovely little template that I work from here that allows me to make sure I record all the species, perhaps draw little sketches, note any perhaps fauna species that I may have seen, birds, frogs, any diggings that I can tell what fauna was there. Or, as I'm now a pretty modern sort of girl, I've got everything sorted now on my iPad. So I can actually do everything as I go, record particular things, take the photo, and it all comes up beautifully on my map. Whatever is the approach you take, make sure you get in there and record that information. The other thing you might want to do before you come into the bush is think about your aims and objectives. So often we're trying to restore our ecosystem. So what does that mean? Well, on this site we're trying to restore the function, the structure of the vegetation, the dynamics, the diversity, the habitat. We want to get it to a point that was as healthy as, if we can, pre-European times. With that, you might also need to define some objectives. And they might need to be redefined post your site assessment. So here, for instance, one of our objectives might be to get all the weeds down to below 5%. And maybe we allow a few benign ones on site, but that's got to be one of our measurable objectives. But remember, they might change once you've done your assessment. Before we get into the bush and start our physical assessment of what's going on, it's a really good idea to do a bit of a background assessment. Bit of a desktop analysis. So it might be that you can look up the mapping for the site, understand the tenure, who owns the site, some of its history might be able to be found out on our internet, all sorts of information. Perhaps there's a good ability to do a threatened species search. Whatever it is, do as much background looking as you can. And if that's not available, consider talking to a local expert. So remember when you're out doing your site assessment to plot on your map where the access points are. There might be multiple ones or one, but it's really important to help with the planning side of ecological restoration and ensuring that our works are efficient. So assessing the native vegetation is really one of the key aspects of it. And again, through your desktop analysis, you might have looked at what the vegetation type used to be. What's your reference ecosystem? What are you aiming for? I've had a look for this site on what, because I'm in Queensland, what the regional ecosystem is. And it's quite an interesting one with some changes between eucalypt and a beautiful dry rainforest understory, as you can see by this gorgeous hoop pine. The influence or changes of that are really fire dependent. So, native vegetation. What species have you got on site? Make yourselves a list. Is it in good health? Do you have issues with dieback in the canopy? Is all the levels or the stratums there that should be there? So have you got a canopy? Is it at the right percentage level? So for a dry eucalypt, is it a 30% canopy? Is it a 70% canopy? What have you got? What's the mid-story look like? Have you got native plants germinating in the understory? Or is that just impacted by weeds? Or have the weeds been there so long that you don't even have a mid-story, which is quite common in some really disturbed rainforest? Have a really good look at what's happening on your site. Make that list. Have you got any threatened species? That's really good to note and really good to take a GPS point of, so you know how to protect them and how we might even try and expand their populations. But importantly, even though your site might have a hell of a lot of weed in it, it's really great to have a think about how your native vegetation recovers post natural disturbance. So a sclerophyll forest might be naturally disturbed by fire, and so how do those species that are here naturally return to site? Do they germinate from the soil seed bank? Do they resprout from epicormic growth? How do they naturally respond to natural disturbance events? Looking at the soil seed bank and thinking about the history, so if your site hasn't eroded away and all your soil's not sitting in the Pacific Ocean, you might have a pretty good soil seed bank, particularly if you've still got a half decent canopy. So you're still going to get seed coming into your site via the standing biomass, but also via birds, flying foxes, wind, water, gravity. Seed is still going to come onto your site. So have a think about, have you got a soil seed bank down there? And is it likely that things aren't germinating just because you've got a whole lot of weed on it? Have a think about your site's capacity for recovery, what we often term resilience. You also need to think about how else can seed get onto your site. So is your site connected to other sites? Or is there natural movement of flora and fauna onto your site? Again, through those dispersal agents that I just mentioned. So it's not just what's happening on the site, but what is influenced by that around your site. That's really key to the analysis and really key to understanding whether you think your site can recover. We can go in there and do weed control, and often that's enough to just help facilitate that recovery again. As we continue to assess our site and really analyse what's going on here, weeds are obviously a really big part of it. In fact, disappointingly, I very rarely see a site nowadays that doesn't have a whole lot of weeds. So how are weeds impacting your site? What are they doing to it? In this particular case, we have a complete understory of weeds. There's natives amongst it, so there's still good recovery potential. But in this case, it's pretty much dominated by lantana, Mickey Mouse bush, ground asparagus, exotic grasses, passion fruit vines, umbrella trees, cadaji, the list goes on. But it's not just about weeds, is it? What are weeds doing and how are they affecting the site? Well, in this case, they're actually really preventing native vegetation from germinating. They're preventing it from establishing and reproducing. But do they have some good points to them? And that's something we always need to think about when we're analysing our site. In some cases, and this is commonly talked about, they might be providing habitat for birds or food sources. And lantana is often talked about in that way. But in this case, I think there's plenty of vegetation around it, plenty of habitat that we can quite easily control this. So yeah, weeds are a very important aspect to analyse because it does influence where we start and how we go about works. And when you're noting your weeds down through your site assessment, remember to note if there's any particularly bad ones out there. So whether that's the particularly invasive weeds such as cat's claw or Madeira vine, or whether that's something that is a declared weed or a noxious weed, because legally we might have to be controlling those as well. So remember to record the points at which they're occurring on your site. Another aspect to think about when you're analysing your site is what other threats do we have? So in a rural situation, is it likely that perhaps cattle are going to keep coming onto the site and perhaps causing some compaction or trampling of plants? In another area where vegetation is perhaps really cleared is erosion an issue, and therefore the fact that your seed bank may not exist. Do you have feral pest animals on your site? So I know Port Macquarie or various areas on the east coast, we've got big issues at the moment with deer. So when planting's required, we're talking about massive tree guards that are pretty expensive. But if you've got foxes, wild dogs, cats, you know, thinking about all of those pest animals, and if one of your goals is to save a particular mammal species or something that's a little bit more sensitive, that could be an issue. Perhaps it's the fact you've got a road right next to your site and you're trying to look after koalas. One of their biggest threats are cars and dogs. Is there regular garden dumping and therefore a regular source of weeds coming onto your site? Is there a sudden change in hydrology where stormwater is now a big issue and so regular flooding or changes in hydrology have happened? So think about your threats, think about how you can manage those, working with your stakeholders to manage those, and really noting that in your plan. So it's all about trying to figure out how we're going to support the recovery of this system. So as you're going through your site, mapping what's here, the good natives, maybe ones that aren't so well, the weeds in this case, big patch dominated by signal grass, write down where they are, take a GPS point, maybe draw a sketch, because underneath this signal grass is probably a beautiful soil seed bank. Now we've brought all that information together and you've really analysed your site from the background, its history, its native vegetation, what's the reference ecosystem, the weeds and other impacts. Bring that information together and have a look. Are those aims and objectives that you defined at the beginning of the process still suitable, or do they need to be modified? And then we're on to stage 2, developing our action plan.